Thank you, Noah. Good afternoon. I'm not going to try to use any Hebrew. I want to thank the JDC and Ashalim for bringing me here and for putting this wonderful conference on and elevating this important issue. To the presenters and practitioners, all of you here today, thank you for making this such an important part of your lives and your work. I am, in many ways, I'm going to say something that I hope each and every one of you would agree with, which is that education is the great moral and economic imperative of our time. Perhaps it was always the case, but it seems to be much more relevant today than at any other point in our history. There are growing disparities, as we know, here in Israel and across the globe. In the United States, the issue is severe, I think, in terms of the disparities between those who have wealth and opportunity and those who don't. Morally, there is an injustice about this situation in terms of the disparities, simply or in particular because of the implications. Significant implications. Dr. Blair showed you a slide with two brains, right? Brain scans, right? One was of a child who was developing normally, and the other one was an extreme case of toxic stress. That is, in many ways, one of the most outrageous, morally outrageous slides I think I've ever seen. If you think about it, I have a 4-year-old and a 2.5-year-old, and to imagine infants, to know that there are millions and millions and millions and millions of infants who are in those awful situations where they don't have the chances that perhaps you and I have had, my children will have, and that is a huge moral injustice. The economic imperative, of course, has to do with our competitiveness. Right? If these disparities continue, which it looks like they will, we become less competitive, not more competitive. If you have fewer people participating, working, innovating, creating, then you are less competitive. You're not growing. You're shrinking. And the opposite is true. If we fix this, if we start to invest in what we know works, we'll have the most significant return. Education, particularly early education, we will become more competitive. You'll have more people participating. It's quite straightforward. This belief that this is the moral and economic imperative of our time comes from personal experiences. I'm a pretty typical middle-class guy from America, from Cincinnati. How many of you have been to Cincinnati? Or no? How many of you, in all honesty, know where Cincinnati is? It's impressive. I'll take it. I spent my summers out west, in the western part of the United States. My stepfather's an anthropologist, and we spent a good chunk of each of our summers on Indian reservations. And these are the native people of North America who were placed, not by accident, very intentionally, on land that was deemed without value. As a result, you will see some of the highest levels of poverty and perhaps what's worse, hopelessness. And those experiences were incredibly formative for me. And we know that that kind of economic disparity and poverty, level of disadvantagedness exists not just on Indian reservations in the United States, but in our inner cities in the United States and all over just about every country, certainly here in Israel. Now, to fix it, we're going to have to do any number of things, including reimagining a system of education, right? This is, in many ways, what I think of when I think of the current system of education. This idea of a little red schoolhouse or a school building in a bubble, as if nothing else outside of that building or anything that came before that building has any bearing whatsoever on what happens to children, right? It's in this bubble. We've treated it as if it was in this bubble. When somebody says education, certainly in the United States, they think of that school, right? K-12, kindergarten through 10th grade or 11th grade or 12th grade. They don't think about all the things that happen at home. They don't think about community. They don't think about health. They don't think about the first 5 years. Some do, more so than they did 5, 10 years ago, but not across the board, not categorically. We have to pop the proverbial bubble, right? If we're going to fix this and build an entirely new system of education. The results, at least in my country, are mixed, right? Some of the most some of our highest performers in the United States remain the highest performers in the world. This is true in Israel, right? Some of the top students in Israel are some of the top students in the world. But of course, there are disparities and communities of people who are not performing at that level. And at least in the United States, things have either gotten worse or remained steady. And this isn't because we haven't tried, right? So decades ago, when, how many of you remember or have heard of President Ronald Reagan? You don't hear his name as much anymore. But Reagan was very focused on this and commissioned a very significant effort and task force and study. And that study revealed, among other things, that things were not heading in the right direction. And there's a quote that stuck with me from this commission's report, that if an unfriendly foreign power had attempted to oppose on America the mediocre educational performance that exists today, we might well have viewed it as an act of war. That's bold. That's a big, bold statement, right? And you would think from the President of the United States, things would change, right? 30 years later, those are your reading scores, very little to no movement. Math scores, very little to no movement. And in the end, it's not about programs or more investments, although there are obviously programs and additional investments that need to be made. It's about, in at least my opinion, building a brand new system of education, right? Popping that bubble. This system of education, in terms of the work we do, is based in large part on 4 aspects. A system of education that's going to be much more successful than the one we've had today has to, first and foremost, follow brain development. And from Dr. Blair and others, you know this, I'm preaching to the choir, so to speak, that means investing very, very early. So your system of education doesn't begin in kindergarten, does it? Doesn't begin even when a child is 4 or 5. In many respects, the system of education should begin prenatally, when brain development begins. Intuitively, that makes sense, right? Number two is this idea that we have to reappraise educators. And by that, I mean value them differently more. This is particularly true in early education. Number three is the classroom has to be transformed. And by that, don't think of, again, that Little Red Schoolhouse. Don't think of the K-12 system. Think about early learning centers. Has to be transformed to help students and children develop the skills they need to be successful adults. Not just reading and numeracy, but collaboration and critical thinking and problem solving and how to care and how to have empathy and how to work well with others, how to follow instruction and sit still. Something I continue to struggle with. And then finally, building this new civic infrastructure, you're going to have a new way of working. That is the collective impact approach that I'll talk about. I'm going to go through each one of these quite quickly, because I want to focus on the last part, which is our approach to change, which is this idea of collective impact. But first, follow brain development. I'm not going to belabor this because you all have, you're living it, you believe in it. Dr. Blair did a phenomenal job explaining why this is so critical. And hopefully our investments, our national priorities, the public will catch up, right? But 90% of the brain is fully developed by age 5, 85% in the first 1,000 days of a child's life. Think about your life. Can anyone immediately tell, or can you tell the person next to you how many days you've been on this planet? Immediately. Can you do the math? Anyone? You can't use your phones. But think about 1,000 days. That's not a long time. But those are the most critical. As we know, this is when so much of brain development occurs. There are huge implications to what happens in those first 1,000 days. Reappraising educators. This is, to me, a huge part of the work that you all have ahead of you and what we have to do in the United States. This is classroom teachers in our schools, but in our early learning centers too. Both of my parents are professors, and I've said to them that, you know, it's not as if we pay our professors tons and tons of money, but in many ways, the salaries that they get should be the salaries that our early learning and development leaders should get. Now, they both should be paid very well. I'm not saying but if you think about the implications on every aspect of our lives, these are the people who should be paid the most, not the least. And then transforming classrooms. This happens to be a picture of a school classroom, a K-12 classroom, older kids. I had a picture of my daughter's classroom, but it doesn't. I don't think it was as good. You wouldn't have been able to see it. But think about it's the same idea. What are they doing? They're doing a project. They're working with each other, right? They're not sitting there being lectured to. How many, other than this very moment where you're all enjoying this very much, how many of you like to be lectured to? How many of you, when you were in school, liked to be lectured to? Not one hand. There's not a single hand. Someone had to have enjoyed it. We keep doing it, right? I mean, this is the way it works. But for little kids, it makes no sense. For any child, it makes no sense. All right, how do we get there? This is our approach. This is the idea behind collective impact from our standpoint, from the work that we've done in Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky and communities all across the country are doing this or doing a similar thing. It's very important to recognize that this is not a model. It's not a program. You don't pick it up and use it here. It's a framework. It's a methodology that we hope and have seen hope will work and have seen work in communities all over the country. It starts in a very different way. You begin to develop with all the people who are in the best position to make change. You develop a shared vision. What do you want to achieve? What do you want to achieve? Simple. Number two is this idea that everything ought to be evidence-based. Data. And I'm going to say data a lot. When I say data, don't think tests, right? Or even assessments. Now, there are tests that are good if they're measuring the right things, and there are assessments that are good if they're measuring the right things. Data is anything. Data is the number of people in this room, right? The time it took you all to come in from break, right? Versus, that's a piece of data. And we have another break, we could actually, this is continuous improvement. You could see the next time how long, I'm not picking on you, I thought you did a very nice job. But it's a piece of data, how long you take the next time. And maybe the idea is that you want to get better and better at getting into the room after a break. Those are pieces of data that allow you to practice continuous improvement, which is at the heart of collective impact. Our version of collective impact. Collaborative action, the idea that then you work together around those outcomes, that shared vision. And finally, the investments and the things that have to be in place to sustain a new effort like this new civic infrastructure. This is what exists today, right? I stole this from Albuquerque. This is one of the communities that's doing this kind of collective impact work. Hopefully you can see it, but the bottom line is everyone's yelling at each other, right? Everyone's pointing the finger. You've got employers pointing the finger at universities, universities pointing the finger at the schools pointing the finger at the early learning folks, the early learning folks pointing the finger at doctors, and so on and so forth, and back to employers. Everyone's pointing the finger. Imagine, this is, in many ways, this to me is representative of the system we live in today, where we are arguing, the adults are sort of fighting, right? Imagine, take that picture. Now, I used to say, imagine them all holding hands. But it's a little naive. What isn't naive, though, is imagine this, and then put in the middle of that center a child, right? Maybe even a 4-year-old or a 3-year-old, and see what happens. See what happens. That has to be at the core of what we do. No matter what, it's all about what's best for children, not what's best for us. That's a huge shift. It's a very big shift. So just a quick story in terms of how this has worked in Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky. This slide usually has more relevancy in the States, but it gives you a sense of the geographic scope. We're focused on the urban core of our region. 3 cities, multiple school districts, multiple universities, lots and lots and lots of early learning and development programs. And we developed over the course of many, many years what it would take to get to a place where every child was succeeding. Succeeding meaning that they entered a meaningful career. They were able to live a middle-class, healthy, happy life. Now, there are academic milestones along the way, and there are family and health outcomes along the way. This is the sort of roadmap, and there are big milestones. We call them dots, right? The big outcomes that we want to see moved. And that's what we did. We focused on outcomes. That's the big shift, right? That's the big shift. So I think about this. I was just talking about this. Someone mentioned, if you think about our budgets, you think about the budget of Israel, of a foundation. It's the line items of programs and initiatives, right? Which would be okay if they laddered up to outcomes. You ever seen an outcome in a budget? Never. I've never seen it. I mean, there are now funders in Cincinnati and northern Kentucky and other cities across the country that have adopted this, where that is the outcome. Where kindergarten readiness rate, third grade reading, high school graduation, that is the line item. And everything we're investing in ladders up to that. Right? And if it doesn't, it's out of there. It doesn't get funded. So you can see these are the outcomes that we're focused on, from school readiness rate all the way down to post-secondary graduation and completion rates. And because of the work of our partners, the Cincinnati School District has seen pretty significant gains. So in school readiness rates, you've seen really now almost a 30% increase, 24 percentage point increase, 16 points in early grade level reading, 24 points in 8th grade math, graduation rates up 10 points. Overall, if you take all of our outcomes across the 3 cities and the universities over the course of this of the partnership, which is, this is a decade's worth of work. Although I'm just looking at the last few years of outcomes, from 66% of the outcomes trending in the right direction to 74, to 81, to 89. And you would think the goal is to get to 100% of the outcomes trending in the right direction. That's just one step along the way. The goal actually is much more important and audacious, which is that every single child will succeed every step of the way from cradle to career, recognizing that the first 5 years, and in particular, the first 1,000 days, are fundamentally important. Fundamentally important. So this has been a framework that communities across the country have adopted to move outcomes, to go from having partnerships and collaboratives, working together on initiatives, to being all focused and working together to move what we call big dots, an outcome like school readiness, or in the case of the work that you all do, birth rates, right? Let's say that's the collective outcome, is a certain percentage increase every year in birth rates by demographic. That's an outcome. And how do you invest in things that are working together to move that particular outcome faster? So it starts with this idea of a shared vision. Simple, right? People come together, this is what we're going to do, we are going to change this. But it's not, we're going to improve, we're going to lower the number of at-risk kids. If that's a measurable, definable thing, then that is actually a wonderful shared vision. And we built this framework, by the way, that helps people, organizations, partnerships go through this process. It's a very straightforward process, but it's important to us that there's some fidelity in it. You pick the scope geographically where you want to focus. The leadership table, who are all the key people that need to be there to make decisions together, big decisions. And how do you message that to your stakeholders, to the community, so people know that there's going to be real action, that there should be movement in this particular outcome? You are going to increase significantly in this country the number of visits to any number of early learning centers or institutions, right? The other piece, and this is one of, I guess, the most important aspects of the difference between collective impact and everything else from our standpoint, is this very significant commitment to evidence-based decision-making. Data informs what you do to improve outcomes, right? And that requires, first and foremost, developing some community-level outcomes. What are the big dials or dots that you want to collectively move together? Right? And what are the milestones along the way? So if you think about visits to the well baby clinics, daycare, preschool, enrichment centers, attendance, that's a collective attendance. That's an outcome that you can move, right? And then there are developmental milestones at each one of these places that if you can collect across communities or in a community, then you move them together. That becomes your North Star. The big lessons here is that you have to have these big North Stars. They're not programmatic. They're not initiative-based. It's not rhetoric. All those things are important. It's an outcome. It's something you can, that's measurable and that you can move. Because if you are trying to move an outcome, you'll move the outcome. If you're trying to increase the number of programs available to kids, you will increase the number of programs available to kids, right? And that's not, I don't say that pejoratively. That's what will happen. The key is, do you want to move an outcome? This is, in many ways, sort of how it works. You start with an outcome, getting very granular, but I think this helps. Then you realize that there are indicators, there are steps along the way. You identify what those are, these contributing indicators, and then you start to organize around those, to move them faster, together, and investing in things that work. I'm going to stop here for a minute. The continuous improvement, it's a box in the framework. It happens to be, in my mind, the most important box, and incidentally, it also has the same, why do I keep blanking on this? Initials, yeah, I don't know why it has the same initials as collective impact, right? Collective impact, the initials are CI, and continuous improvement is? This is my way of trying to make you remember that the most important aspect of collective impact is continuous improvement. This is very different than even just database decision-making. Continuous improvement is a fundamental shift in mentality, right? It's the idea that you're going to continue to get better, that that's the goal. It's not about proving whether or not something works. We do that a lot. That works, that doesn't work, I can prove it, right? It's about getting better, constantly getting better. And there's a methodology and a process to that. It will move your outcomes faster than any other approach. Any other approach. I'm actually going to leverage Professor Rosenfeld here, one of JDC's finest. This is one of my favorite aspects of continuous improvement, and I don't know if Professor Rosenfeld knew when he handed me an article about success an hour or so ago that I was going to talk about it in the context of continuous improvement. But this is the success, he writes, he and others write, it's good to have success, right? The problem with success, and there are problems with success, there are three in particular, and this is where continuous improvement helps. Success, hey, this is working, right? This is working. We're improving these outcomes. This program is having an impact. Success has the tendency to do some very bad things. It helps maintain the status quo. It's working. Keep doing it. You don't have to change anything. Keep doing it. In fact, don't change anything because you don't want to rock the boat. It's working, right? The last thing you want is failure. That's embarrassing. It's working. What did you do? It was working. Keep going. Don't stop. Number two is this idea of overconfidence. It's working, so let's invest more. Let's just keep going. And lastly, and most importantly, it makes you less adaptable, right? So things change. If it's working and you just decide that you're going to rest on your laurels, you are going to be less adaptable to change. Things change. Everything changes. Continuous improvement allows failure is kind of a negative. It's a negative word. It's just that this particular intervention either didn't work or it worked, but it didn't work well enough, or it worked really well, but you can keep getting better. You keep getting better. through continuous improvement. I have 10 minutes, but I'm going to tell 3 quick stories to give you an example of this. Children's Hospital. We do a lot of work with Cincinnati Children's Hospital. One of my favorite stories is they celebrated this one success. It's a great story. 96% of their patients said that they had a satisfactory experience when they went to Children's. 96%. That, you should celebrate that, right? They actually were throwing a party. It's a very big deal. And then somebody mentioned, one of the Board of Trustees mentioned, don't we have 1 million visitors a year? And somebody says, yes, of course we have 1 million visitors. And 96% of those people were very happy. They were satisfied with their visit. And he said, well, then 40,000 people weren't. That's a lot of people. 40,000 people, that's a lot of people who weren't satisfied. Story number 2, we have a thing called the Learning Partner Dashboard that takes student-level data and combines it with school-level data. Support level data, services, mentoring, after school, health, and you get to see, it's this huge innovation. They've written stories about it. It's a wonderful piece of innovation that allows you to see what kids are getting and what they're not getting. So we were excited about the success. It wasn't until we started doing continuous improvement on it did we realize that we had a long way to go, still do. Only half of the people that were supposed to be using it were actually using it, right? Through continuous improvement, we've gotten that number up to 90%. Now we have to get to 100%. When we get to 100%, continuous improvement says find something else to make better, right? How they use it, what they put in it. That's the idea. You keep getting better. The third story is in a safety award, also with the Children's Hospital. They got a big award for being very safe, and the same board of trustees member says, I get all my stories from the same guy, so he's the one that tells the stories or asks the big questions. He says, what's the serious safety event? We got this wonderful award in safety. What is the serious safety event rate at our hospital? That is, how many children did we kill? You could say died in our care, but it's because of what we did. And no one knew the number. They didn't know the number. It was 15. And then they decided what the goal should be. That's their big outcome. That's their big dial. And what do you think it should be? Someone say it louder. 0. It should be 0. They've gotten it down to 4. So that means in the last 5 years, 43 kids they're alive because of this. They're alive because of this continuous improvement. They're not done at 4. 4 is one of the best, if not the best in the country. It's been 300 days since they've had a serious safety event. 320 days, maybe. They won't stop until they get to 0, nor should they. And then this idea of, in the interest of time, and because Mitch did a nice job mentioning it already, it's a quite simple process. You plan, you do, you check the data, you're constantly looking at the data, and you act. There is this idea that one of the core aspects of this is that you have to sustain it, and by sustaining this kind of effort requires investments in the outcomes. Start investing in the outcomes. Make sure your money is going to the outcomes, public and private. Your energy, your volunteer capacity, your human capacity, your leadership capacity, everything is going towards those outcomes, improving those outcomes. That you're investing in data systems, continuous improvement, and training people on continuous improvement. That is huge. And the staff to support it, right? There has to be some of you who work on just the collaborative part of this, right? The work that involves all of you. So lastly, I'm going to close by just telling you or giving you a sense from our perspective, the difference between what people are used to from a collaborative standpoint or partnerships, which are wonderful, to collective impact. The first is that in collaboration, and this is familiar hopefully, people and organizations are convened around an initiative or a program, right? To support the elderly, to build more of these things, to do more of these programs, those programs. Collective impact is about organizing around an outcome. And if you think about the 0 to 5 or 0 to 3 or first 1,000 days space, there are tons of outcomes. What are the most important ones? And then get organized around that or those. Number 2 is you use data to prove something in the world in which we live in today. That's what most evaluations do. They prove something worked or it didn't work. It's just not that simple. Nothing in life is that simple. Alternatively, you use data to improve, constantly getting better at what you're doing. In collaboration, it's in addition to what you do, right? So you have your day job, and then you do a little bit of this partnership work, and you come to things like this, and you sit in other meetings, and you participate in seminars and webinars and all that. So it's part of what you do. In collective impact, it's all of what you do. It's what you do. That's your job. And you go from advocating for ideas, something you may have read about or something that's working in another city, to advocating for what you know works. What you know works. We've learned a lot. One is that there's a framework for this, and I'm pretty sure that on the JDC's website, the Ashalim's website, you can find this framework, and it's a pretty reliable tool. It's now working in over 50 cities across the country. It is not a model. What it looks like in Cincinnati is very different than what it looks like in Dallas, or in Albuquerque, or Anchorage, Alaska. We go to the strangest places in the United States to do this, and it always looks different because the context in which it's happening is different. Their needs are different. The outcomes that they choose are different. Their data systems are different. The data they're collecting is different, right? Sometimes they have a different continuous improvement process. That's okay. These are some of the core lessons, right? That you get to a point where you have shared accountability. You're all in it together. You're all responsible for the outcomes, but everyone does something a little bit differently. That's okay. That's important. Number 2 is that you never let perfect be the enemy of good. People always think, well, we don't have the data you're talking about. There's not enough data. You have way more data. In every instance, you have way more data than you think. And I'm not talking about annual community level data. I'm talking about daily, weekly, child level data. You have way more than you think. Make sure that data helps to improve and to drive action, not to blame or to beat people up. That's a huge cultural shift that if it doesn't take place, this doesn't work. And finally, there's this idea of a backbone. There has to be staff to support it, to keep it going, because it is hard. Conceptually, it's easy. It makes sense, right? But it's very hard work. And you have to have people who are committed, who wake up every day doing just this. So let me say in closing, I think the opportunities around early learning are enormous, and the issue could not be more important, right? There's so much infrastructure and things that are already in place in all other aspects of education. But in the 0 to 3, 0 to 5 space, there's so much more opportunity to create this kind of new infrastructure, to do the kind of work that we would propose. And then finally, our president, President Obama, has said several years ago that the future belongs to the nation that best educates their children. The future belongs to the nation that best educates their children. I would modify it, and not just because of this audience. I would do it anywhere, that the future belongs to the nation that best educates and supports their children, their infants, because of everything we know to be true about brain development and the implications of whether you get that right or not. That's to whom the future belongs, and that can be Israel. That can be you. So good luck and God bless you. Thank you.